So some have argued that even if I'm a committed vegetarian my whole life, it's not clear that this actually could save even one animal's life. And that's because meat production isn't sensitive to demand in such a fine-grained way. So the supply chain of meat is just too complex to respond to an individual's decision to buy or not to buy meat. So does this make it futile to be a vegetarian?
I don't accept the argument that you're putting forward there. What we should act on is the expected value of our decisions. Obviously, we can't know what results will come from our decisions, but we have to go by probabilities. That's the guide of life. So even though it's true that the supply chain is not sensitive to the purchase of one chicken, let's say, if you're avoiding chicken your entire life, then I think the expectation is that many of your days when you don't eat a chicken will have no effect. But every now and again, one day when you don't buy a chicken will have a very large effect, because there must be a cut-off point somewhere at which the supermarket or wherever you'd be buying from will say, oh, we're not selling enough chickens, let's order 200 fewer chickens tomorrow, right?
So what if I eat a hamburger just once a year?
I think the expected value question is the same. I mean, the benefit to you, if there is any benefit, I would argue there's actually a negative benefit to you, harm to you by eating it. But if there were a benefit, then the benefit is smaller and the chances of it making a difference are smaller. But I think it all averages out. I mean, I can't understand how otherwise you could have a supply and demand system if it doesn't average out over the long run, and if each individual decision doesn't have a chance of affecting the supply.
So what if the hamburger is produced from a happy cow? Would that make it better? So a cow that had a good life with lots of space in a pleasant meadow that was slaughtered painlessly, would you have any objection against eating a happy cow? A hamburger made from a happy cow?
I think the objection is somewhat mitigated there. I do think clearly it's better to eat the meat of animals who've led happy lives and the meat of animals who've suffered. I think you still have to think about a number of different factors. One is the impact that your example is having, because is it going to be clear to people that you're conscientious in your choice of meats? I mean, if you make a big point about that and everybody who sees you eating the hamburger knows that you wouldn't have eaten it if it was not from a cow that had a happy life, that might meet that objection. Then there's questions about was the animal happy throughout its life? Was it, for example, perhaps happy for most of its life, but then transported to a slaughterhouse in horrible conditions and killed in a brutal way? So there's a lot to find out. And finally, and this applies particularly if you're talking about cows, there is the impact on climate change that you're having. And ruminant animals, cattle and sheep, are particularly large contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So that isn't helped by the fact that it's a happy cow. In fact, there's some evidence that cattle on grass produce more greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of meat produced than cattle who are fed grain.
Economic arguments might suggest that if fewer people buy meat, the price of meat will go down, which will result in others buying more meat. So could this make it futile to be a vegetarian?
I think that what we don't know a lot about consumer purchases and to what extent it's relevant. I think what you need to hope is that if fewer people buy meat, the price of meat drops below the production costs. So what the producers are getting no longer covers their costs. And if it no longer covers their costs, then the fact that more people want to buy it isn't going to help. It's only if they come in and push the price up again so that the producers do cover their costs. So it depends on a number of questions that I don't think we really know the answer to. The other factor that you have to take into account here is, can you build up a critical mass of people who are avoiding meat and thereby creating a market for plant-based alternatives to meat? And I think that's in fact already starting to happen. We're starting to see more and better plant-based alternatives to meat on sale, not just in specialist health food stores, but in mainstream supermarkets. And I think if we need to encourage that trend, because if these products become economical, more environmentally sustainable than meat, obviously less cruel than meat, and comparable in taste to meat, then I think we have a real chance of essentially replacing the entire meat production industry.
So here's another possible argument against vegetarianism. So in a recent article in The Conversation, Mike Archer refers to figures that suggest that in Australia, 25 times more animals die in the production of plant protein than in the production of the same amount of protein from grass-fed cattle and sheep. And that's, for example, because many animals die when the fields are ploughed or when their habitat is destroyed to make space for crops. So does this make it unethical for Australians to be vegetarian?
Well, I think Michael Archer really gets this wrong because, firstly, this would only apply to completely grass-fed meat. It wouldn't apply to animals that have been fed grain even for part of their lives. And the vast majority of Australian beef comes from animals who are fed grain, at least for the last 3 months of their lives. And because it's so inefficient to feed grain to cattle, you're actually having to produce more grain and therefore kill more of these small rodents and other animals in the wheat fields by growing grain, feeding it to animals, and then eating the meat. So you're actually reducing the number of small animals if you eat the grain directly than if you eat the grain after it's been cycled through the animal. Now, if you just would say, well, I'll only eat the grass-fed meat, then there are still some things to be said about that. One is, as I've already mentioned, you are making a major contribution to greenhouse gases. And that's something that I think needs to be taken into account as well. The other thing is that Archer suggests that there's less suffering, not just less killing, but less suffering. And I think he's wrong about that because he says the cattle are killed humanely. But even if the actual moment of death is humane, if you look at cattle in Australia's rangelands, which basically means places in the more remote regions of the north and northwest of Australia, these cattle are rounded up in horrible conditions. I've seen this happen because they're pretty much wild animals. They haven't really had contact with humans very often. And then they're rounded up, they're terrified, they're herded onto trucks, and then they're driven on these trucks, maybe 1,000 kilometres, maybe 1,500 kilometres, very long distances to slaughterhouses, and perhaps in great heat and without stopping to be fed and watered. I think it's a quite horrible process. And if you compare that with a mouse, let's say, that is killed by the harvester, it has a pretty quick death compared to the suffering that the cattle have gone through.
So billions of animals suffer tremendously in the livestock industry. Now, if it became technically possible, would it be okay to use gene editing to produce livestock that can't feel pain?
I certainly think it would be better if livestock could not feel pain. Of course, we're not just talking about physical pain, we're also talking about mental suffering, like boredom from confinement in cages or stress from those conditions. So if you could actually get rid of that, and then I think that would be a preferable situation to the present one. Again, there would still be other reasons. Even if you completely eliminate the suffering, there would still be environmental reasons, I think, for trying to eliminate particularly the ruminant animals, but also from point of view of wasting grain, you would still want to eliminate the rest of the meat industry as well. But it would be a different kind of issue. If there was no suffering, then there would be more relating to environmental questions rather clearly than animal welfare questions, because the animals wouldn't have a welfare.
But isn't there a risk that this will result in even more people consuming meat because they will think that it's less ethically problematic now?
This is the kind of thing that has also been said about other reforms that have already happened. For example, the idea that in the European Union that there are restrictions on how you can keep hens. You can't keep them in the standard small wire cages that you used to. And the same with pigs and veal calves. They have to be able to turn around and move a little bit, which previously they didn't. And some people worried that this would actually lead to a greater acceptability of meat consumption. But if you look at what's happened in the European Union since those reforms have been introduced, which is now, I think they started around 2010, if I remember rightly, so we've now got sort of 7 years, and In fact, it doesn't seem that there has been an increase in meat consumption. Rather, it seems there's been an increase in acceptance of vegetarian and vegan food. So I think that perhaps this effect would not take place. I can't be sure, of course, but I think it's reasonable that it would be a sign of increased concern about animals that would make people think more about animals, and maybe therefore they would still be reluctant to eat them.
Do you think schools should offer only vegetarian or vegan food? Because perhaps this would be a good way to steer younger generations towards eating no or less meat.
I think that would be an excellent move, yes, if schools were prepared to do that. Of course, there's always a question about how much, particularly if you're talking about government schools here. Private schools can do what they like, I guess, but if you're talking about government schools, there's always a question about how far a government can get ahead of where the population is. So I think that might work in some regions where there's very high acceptance of arguments against eating meat, but probably in mainstream schools, they're just not ready for it yet.
Do you think people are reluctant to do this because they're concerned about the health of the children?
I imagine that there would be some concerns about the health of the children, and of course those who are trying to promote the production and sale of meat would stir up those fears as much as they could. But I think certainly if you're just talking about a vegetarian diet, I think there's no question that a vegetarian diet can be a perfectly healthy way of nourishing children, and probably healthier than a meat-based one. If you're talking about a vegan diet, a little bit more care would be needed. You would need to make sure that children got enough B12, for example. So there might be more concerns, but I think we're understanding more about how to do that. I think we can have fortified foods that contain the necessary ingredients. So probably this is a little futuristic, but if we're talking about over the next decade or so, then I think it's possible that we could meet those concerns about the health of the children.